What do you get when a Greek philosopher, a Roman senator, and a Jewish rabbi walk into a bar and start debating, while a Catholic bartender listens and takes notes? The Western legal tradition, of course. Hello, everyone. Peace be with you. This is attorney Nathan Sweet here. Welcome to the Catholic American, where we explore the intersections of faith, of history, of politics, of the spiritual life as an American Catholics shaping our nation today. Today, we delve into the profound roots of Western thought and law and how they can help us know the way through the chaos of today's world. And man, it is chaotic. Seems like every day something new happens. We got here to our legal system and our form of government not by a single event in history. It gradually occurred over centuries. Like my golf game. Golf is a complicated sport, if you haven't played it before. I was a late in life golfer, and I had a lot to learn. And when you get into it, you look really bad. But if you are willing to look foolish for long enough and keep learning, things get better, even if over time, they evolve over time. If you get a good coach and you know where you're supposed to go with your golf game, how you're supposed to move your body, that coach will teach you the game of golf over time, and he will direct you toward a better way of doing things. Well, that's what God has done through the church with our legal system over time, because we have work to do as human beings, and we have purpose because we're made in His image. He has allowed this system, as imperfect as it has been, to not just be handed down in a single event, but to evolve and be discovered over time. And along the way, there were mistakes, there were problems, but that change and evolution over time along the way is really, really important to understanding how this thing how we got here. So, like my golf game, with golf, we just try to improve an area of our game sometimes, and other areas can lag behind until you get them and you get better at them. Sometimes, if you get better at one area of the game, other areas can lag until you get to them. And golf, it reveals sometimes that you have to get better at another part of your game. Like as you get better at like hitting greens, and then you realize, take chipping for example. When I first started hitting the ball well enough to get a chance of getting on the green and the right amount of strokes, you start missing greens to the right and the left and the sand trap, etc. And you realize your chipping is terrible and it needs to get better. So we talked about the investiture struggle before and the Gregorian Revolution and how that sparked this first separation of church and state. We talked about that last week. This revolution of separation of church and state in that manner led to the development of the canon law within the church. And we'll talk about how that canon law was amazing, and that amazing development was how it basically evolved into other parts of our system. So we will talk about how amazing that development was and how it led to our modern legal system and its roots in different ways as we go forward. But this event also kicked off a rediscovery, like I talked about with King Josiah, of many ancient ideas. So Greek philosophy was one of them, Judaism, and the Roman way of thinking. All were kicked off. The re-examination of those things were kicked off at that point in time. So, like King Josiah, who was in the Old Testament, many ancient ideas were rediscovered. And they were Greek philosophy, Judaism, and Roman thinking. It's not that they were completely lost, it's that they were re-examined and were looked into to find a cohesive framework. Our legal ancestors drew from these pre-Western sources as they returned in various periods of Renaissance. These revivals and rediscoveries and revivals throughout the West are characteristics of us in the West. We are not Greek alone, our Western tradition. We are not Roman alone. We are not ancient Judaism in America. There's a big difference even between the way that those three would think. But in a way, they became spiritual ancestors of the West. Not primarily by a process of survival alone, or like succession, just passing it down, but primarily by a process of adoption. Our legal and political systems adopted them as our ancestors by choice. It's kind of like that really sweet elderly lady or elderly grandpa that you meet somewhere and you wish they were your grandparents too. People did this with my grandpa all the time because he was the absolute best. And you're like, he's my grandpa, you know. But people, like when you meet a really sweet old person, elderly person, you want to, kind of adopt them as your grandparent. Well, the adoption was one of choice, not of actual inheritance. We weren't all Greek or all Roman or all Jewish. And it was passed down over time by rediscovery, not passed down directly. You can picture my opening joke that if the three of them walked into a bar, they would probably clash and argue about some things if you know anything about what they thought. Because Greeks focused on the natural law and reason, and the Romans focused on power and order, and ancient Jews focused on their holy faith. So some Roman law, to be sure, survived after the fall of Rome, before the investiture struggle, for sure. Because the investiture struggle, remember, wasn't really over until 1122. We had Roman law that survived in pieces and in areas during that time. And of course, the Hebrew Old Testament survived in our faith as well. But the survival alone only accounts for a small part of the overall Western influence and Western philosophy and Western theology. Their influence on us today is more from re-examinations and rediscoveries and new receptions of them in periods by thinkers in Western thought and in the Catholic Church. So skipping a lot of the different things for time's sake, I want you to remember that their influence on us today is more from the re-examination, rediscovery, and receptions of them. So as we go along, we're going to see lots of different examples of things and how in future podcasts we're going to be looking at, how this happened in detail. I'll give you good examples. But the bottom line is, for right now, is what principles did they pass on to us in our system that are so beautiful and so important that you need to be using them to interpret the world around you today in the chaos? What principles do we need as Catholic Americans that we've inherited that we may not be aware of? Well, the Greek influences came from Greek philosophy. Trying to think rationally like the Greeks developed is really hard. Reason, though, is essential to our system. The ability to think for yourself and to find truth is essential for a free person, for a person in a democratic system. To not fall blind to passion or sensationalism. To think clearly in a world around you when it's going wild and going wrong. To think about ethical principles and dialectical reasoning, which provided the intellectual tools for systematic legal analysis in the law, and concepts such as natural law. What does the natural world teach us about how things should be? If you look back what you felt in the past 10 or 20 years as an American Catholic about politics or law, you may see where you felt like you were manipulated into thinking something was good back then, that now you look back and say, man, that was not a good idea. Like me trying to, go for it in golf sometimes. Just not a good idea. Okay, so how important is it to go back and try to find out why you were duped with logic? Because you're the same feeling, fallible human being that you were before. Another reason to follow along in this podcast is eventually we're going to provide with some basic logic that we as Catholic Americans can use to snip out when a politician or a college professor these days or somebody, a podcaster with an agenda, are trying to manipulate us. The second thing that we talked about is Judaism. And it was so impactful because it offered a moral and ethical foundation rooted in divine law and in covenantal obligations and in prophetic emphasis on justice, infusing the tradition with a sense of transcendent purpose and conscience. And this is key because you can write down laws all you want to and apply them to everyone equally, but those rules are in, but what are those rules, and are those rules just in the highest sense? And that is essential to keeping society growing on the right track. So we can obviously sense that over time things have gotten tremendously better since the Roman times in a lot of areas. Though that process of human beings before us asking the questions and struggling with the answers of what is right and wrong in the highest sense before our Creator was really, really important. And we inherited that from Judaism and, of course, from Christianity as well. This is why Catholics, we must reject a lot of modern wokeism and their formulation of history. That's a show for another day, but just remember that the West was not always what it is today. And the aim toward what God wants us to do in society about human rights and society is what led to the progress itself. So don't listen to all that criticism that, all us people in the West and us Christians are just all bad and all that we did was, just evil. It's like, well, the rest of the world was too. And we were the ones that helped bring us out of that. And the very act of you criticizing the West and spitting on it and while you stand on top of its foundations is hilariously hypocritical, because the Christian ethos, the Catholic ethos through the Western legal tradition is what allowed you to even see that these things are wrong. And that was progress over time. And people always think that if they were born back then that they would be so much better. And it's like, no, you wouldn't. You're a fallible human being. And these ideas took time to evolve. And the gospel, as Christians, we know our job is to retake the world in a spiritual sense for good, and undo the fall and the curse in our areas where God puts us. And whether it's being a lawyer, or it's being a doctor, or a teacher, or a cab driver, you're supposed to make the world better in your sphere of influence through the gospel. And over time, because God is not an autocrat and didn't just by fiat change everything. He invites us to be used in His kingdom and in the development. And that's the exciting thing about being a Catholic. You know what? Your faith has been here. It's the oldest institution in the history of the world, and it'll be here. It was founded by Christ on St. Peter. It ain't going anywhere. The gates of hell ain't prevailing against it. So every moment that you invest in your life into the church, into the Catholic faith, into carrying on this Western tradition, it has meaning, because you're investing into something that will last. It's outlasted governments. It's outlasted kingdoms and empires. So really cool. This progress has taken place over time. And we as Catholic Americans, whether we're right wing or left wing, we can really help, bring people to a realization of this special thing that we've got that came from the church. So third and finally, Roman thinking supplied structural elements such as the procedural methods and codifications from something called the Corpus Juris Civilis, including also something called the Jus Gentium, which emphasized governance and equity and institutional organization. This is huge. We Catholics should be weary when any president or political party begins to ignore the Western idea that law should be written down. It should be codified and then followed. Codified meaning it's written down, and that it's organized, and it must be followed by everyone. Creating panic and the need for a response by ignoring legal norms is a recipe for disaster in our system. And politicians in both parties have done this. And if you think of our great current example, if you think of our current immigration problem, President Biden, sworn constitutional president of the United States, Catholic, he had a duty to enforce the borders and uphold our laws. And I think it's pretty much understood that he didn't. Whether you like that or not, you can at least acknowledge that they did not. And this omission was tragic and led to chaos. And again, this omission is tragic and led to chaos. And the response from President Trump, obviously during the campaign, he seized on it. He seemed like he only talked about the criminals and the gangs coming across the border. And there were those things that came across the border. But he portrayed immigrants, it seemed, every time he talked, only in the worst way. There was no nuance there that we see as Catholics, as Christians. No distinction between the hardworking human beings that want to come over and who are desperate for a better life and who are willing to work twice as hard as many Americans. And now we have the rule of law being pushed to new extremes to combat the problem that itself originated from President Biden and others ignoring the rule of law. I hate to tell you, but that's what happened. And that's what's happening now as it's being pushed as an excuse for fixing that problem. But hopefully, those of you on the right and left, you Catholics on the right and left, can realize that the problem is not the rule of law, like sometimes seems to be alluded to. They love to blame the rule of law, which they, by the way, the politicians enacted and ratified. And they love to blame people in the courts for all the problems. And the courts are just following the law. And they love to make political, work of what happens in the courts for their own gain. But a common historical goal of tyrants is to degrade the rule of law in the minds of people, so their extreme actions will be seen as necessary. The result is always horrible. And we Catholics in both parties and everywhere in between must be the messenger of this hope, that let's get back to the rule of law and common commitment of the rule of law together. And I'll say this, I'm not calling President Trump a Nazi or a tyrant or anything like that, okay? I'm not calling President Biden that. I think that well-meaning people even can try to, gain political points, be showmen, but we have to keep our heads about us when everyone else around seems to be, losing theirs. And we have to remember, as the principles that we inherited from our ancient ancestors, where they were harmonized through theological meditation and transforming these disparate influences into a unified legal system that's codified and should be followed. That system that's balanced with the balanced reason and morality and authority, we did that. And it's really, really important that we recommit ourselves and we hold the politicians and both of our parties to following the rule of law. And us Catholics began that process in the West. We were the bartender taking notes in my example. And I'll give you a quick example. Lots of cool things we'll talk about over the year where we get to the details of this that you might find interesting. But one, scholastic teaching methods. They adapted Greek ways of thinking and training for law students and for classical education in the West. While Jewish moral ideas, came along as well for areas like usury. Okay, so the Catholic Church adapted Greek ways of training for law and classical education, while Jewish moral concepts influenced prohibitions like usury and other wrongs that should be seen as morally wrong, but may have been legal in other cultures like usury and lending. And Roman structures that we had, they served as the subsidiary foundation, the bottom foundation for emerging canon law in the church, and then royal law back then. And over time, this ongoing integration ensured the tradition's adaptability. It allowed us to evolve in response to social, political, and economic changes without losing our core principles. So it allowed us to move into the West, into different areas of the West and different cultures. Finally, this synthesis of the good and the true and drawing the highest truths from cultures and traditions into the church and into our legal system, as we Catholics did when we evangelized the whole West, the whole world. It's what the church does at its best, as Bishop Barron always says. We should be proud of this. And understanding this sidebar will help dispel particularly evil conspiracy theories in American culture. I won't mention any names or denominations or particular groups. And there's certainly in atheistic circles that we are just going around incorporating more and more paganism into Catholicism over time, and that it somehow corrupted the church. But instead, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing instead when there were prefigurements of the divine that he had put in and allowed to be seen in different cultures before the full Catholic Church got there. That the Logos, the God of the universe, the very information, already existing in the cultures, he put them there. And we were able to elevate them to their highest form in Christ. And cast off what we obviously couldn't accept as in the plenty of areas that we transformed that were wrong. And this was a process that took place over time. It wasn't immediate. God works through us. We are his hand and feet. We understand that in the Catholic Church better than I think anybody. Paul's sermon to the Greeks comes to mind here. This drawing all nations to Christ is how we evangelized the world and changed our legal systems and our governments for the good as well. And that's how we'll do it again. That's how we'll re-evangelize the world. That's how we'll reestablish the rule of law and the commitment to it, is by taking in what we can and casting off what is evil, what's wrong. And from a Catholic American perspective, this historical process, it underscores the Church's role in fostering legal framework grounded in faith and in justice. Remember, justice is one of the cardinal virtues for us Catholics. These principles, as we will talk about, resonate in our founding documents as a nation too, and our current government. The principles are there. These principles, and we'll talk about them, they resonate in our nation's founding documents and our current government. And they have to be followed in order for the system to work. And I would like you to take this time to follow this podcast. I invite you on this journey with me. I think of it as voting to save the West, because this message is not getting out there enough. And the tradition that both liberal and conservative Americans, American Catholics, can hopefully bring this back together, and that our thought is built upon this Western legal tradition. We have to remind each other first, which is why Catholic comes before American. Then we can remind those around us of the importance of staying within this tradition and hold our politicians accountable when they're not acting like that. And we can have the courage as Catholics to hold them when they're in our own party. We can have the courage to hold them to the rule of law and not just accuse and yell at the other side. This tradition is really important, and viewing whatever next legal revolutions come, from AI to class changes and class conflict, whatever next legal revolutions come, we need to view in light of these traditions. Everything in this podcast is going to be assessed with this tradition and this love of our legal system and the rule of law, as well as our faith. We need this more than ever. We are in a crisis. And starting this week, I'm going to start skipping ahead and reviewing some current news events from this, I think, fair and deeply traditional perspective. It doesn't mean you have to agree with my comments, but maybe you should think about wrestling with whether you are putting the tradition of the West, this beautiful thing that we were handed down, a system that evolved with due process and the rule of law, in jeopardy by just going with your blind passion and not using reason and not using, the rule of law and not thinking towards the highest good, but just about, your current reaction. And maybe you could start to think about these current events more like that. And although you can't see it, I want to remind you that this Western tradition that you are a part of is more beautiful than any Mona Lisa, more beautiful than any painting out there, because it lays the foundation for a good society. Then we're gonna work forward in the tradition each week, once a week in a podcast like this, real simple, short, and hopefully connect the current events over time with what's happened in the past. And hopefully that'll let us remember, as we Catholics can remind our people around us, our neighbors, that we are not enemies, that we are neighbors, that we're fellow human beings, and we are fellow sojourners towards our heavenly home, whether we are on the Catholic left or the Catholic right or somewhere in between. Let's treat each other like that. And if you interact with people who are not Catholic this week and they are hostile to you, first in humility, remember that you were once afar off and you were separated from God, like Paul says in Ephesians 2, that you should speak truth in love. And remember, as my patron saint, St. Thomas More, said, you are the King's good servant, but God's first. And that's why it's the Catholic American on this podcast and not the American Catholic, because you are the King's good servant. We want to be good American citizens, but we're God's first. So go forth and be a happy warrior this week for the faith. Treat people around you with love and respect, and tune in to the Catholic American as we go through this. Thank you for your time, and we'll chat later. Cheers.